Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
John the Baptizer made his appearance as a preacher in the desert of Judea. This was his theme: reform your lives. The reign of God is at hand.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father Ken Mormon, who is a scriptural scholar and priest of the Diocese of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections is reforming our lives. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Ken, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the season of Advent, and specifically the second Sunday of Advent. As we know, there's 4 Sundays during the Advent season, and I suppose there's sort of a build-up in these Sundays. There's a progression of thought and a gradual movement towards the great feast of Christmas that we think of as the Incarnation, and the God coming and pitching His tent in our midst. And so it's something that in the liturgical cycle we're trying to build up, I think, to a greater appreciation of that coming of the Lord. And the scripture readings for Advent, I think, are very helpful along that line. But Advent does have its own rhythms. I guess we catch that, but the Advent wreath, don't we? There's a build-up, a kind of idea, a Germanic custom that we've taken on here in the United States, and some people do that in their homes. They will light a candle at the first Sunday of Advent and then light 2 of them for the second Sunday and so on. And it gives a feel of progression, greater light coming in. In fact, we often do that right within the churches these days, have the Advent wreath.
Yes. There's in another sense as well, there's each Sunday of Advent has a slightly different focus or a building as well. In the beginning, the first Sunday of Advent, we're very much still in the frame of mind looking towards the end of the world and the second coming of Christ, so to speak. In the middle 2 Sundays, our attention draws more towards John the Baptist and the role of preparing for the first coming of Christ. And by the time we get to the last Sunday of Advent, then we're into the very immediate preparations for the liturgical celebration of Christ's first coming at Christmas. Mm-hmm. And so each Sunday the readings are chosen in such that they respect that dynamic, that growth in our appreciation.
Mm-hmm. So we often talk about Advent is in terms of coming, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the themes of Advent. There is a coming of the Lord, and that's always difficult to sort of sort out, but I think there's a feeling that we don't want to limit that. We want that to be a broad kind of concept, so the Lord comes to us in many ways. I mean, we have the Incarnation, the historical event 2,000 years ago, where God came to us in a special way, and Jesus of Nazareth and His birth, but there's a coming in grace as well, that we believe God comes to us in all aspects of our lives, and every moment God's grace surrounds us. We need to be alert to it and aware of it, and there's always God opening up new possibilities for us. If we close a door, God opens up a new one for us. We commit a sin, and there's forgiveness for us, and redemption, salvation that comes to us right in the immediate moment. And so there's a coming in daily life that we talk about, and then there's a coming of the Lord at the end time. The final coming. I know my own teacher, Karl Rahner, never liked that talk of second coming so much, because he says, no, it's really better thought of not as a second coming, as though Christ was absent for a while. He walked around and left, and He'll come back after we muddle around for a while, but that it's really better thought of as a completion or a fulfillment of Christ's work. Then that's the other thing we celebrate at Advent, is the coming of the Lord finally at the end time to complete this whole historical process.
That's a good insight, and his insight would fit very well. This year we're in the Matthew cycle of the lectionary, and in Matthew's gospel, of course, Jesus never leaves the church. When the final scene in chapter 28, He tells the disciples gathered there that He will be with them always, even to the end of the age. So instead of, in kind of Luke's conception of going off to sit at the right hand of God and wait until the time of refreshment occurs, in Matthew's gospel, his insight is that Jesus still remains with His church throughout, even during this period of time. So as Karl Rahner said, it's more of a fulfillment of His first coming than a separate or completely unrelated second coming.
We can use a lot of images to get at that. It's the building up of the body of Christ. Paul talks about the pleroma, the fullness that comes, finally throughout history and human effort and our attempts to cooperate with God and so on, we build up the body of Christ, and it will be finally complete and fulfilled only at the end time. So it's a lot of ways we have in the Scriptures to talk about this completion of the work of Christ, which I think Advent puts before us. The Advent season is a marvelous time, isn't it? I mean, there's great Scripture readings. You being a Scripture scholar, I think, really appreciate that, and there's a lot of rich imagery in them, and it touches the emotions as well as the mind, for sure.
A number of years ago, there was a movie, A Little Big Man, and the Indian chief,
Dustin Hoffman, right?
Yes,
Little
exactly.
Big Man, yeah.
And the Indian chief's comment was, when he was happy, it made his heart soar like a hawk. And I think of that phrase every once in a while as I read these readings for the Advent season.
Yeah.
They make your heart soar with anticipation and possibility.
You talked about this being the year of Matthew. That's what we're on is a 3-year cycle, right? And each year we read primarily from a different gospel. So the year A is from Matthew's gospel, and then B is from Mark, and C is from Luke. And then John's writings are often used around the major feast, right? And the highlights of the church year. I think maybe the other thing about this reading is to remember that the mainline Christian churches, Protestant churches joining us, and the Orthodox as well, in doing the same readings, so that people would be hearing these same readings in the mainline Christian churches on these Sundays of Advent. And on the second Sunday of Advent, as you suggested, the reading would be from Matthew. It's actually from the 3rd chapter, and it talks about John the Baptist. And there's a phrase in there, Ken, I'd like to pick up on and make the focus of our discussion of this second Sunday of Advent. And that is, it says, when John the Baptizer made his appearance as a preacher in the desert of Judea, this was his theme: reform your lives. The reign of God is at hand. Reform your lives. And I'd like to move with that sort of focus here in our discussion. What does it mean to talk about reforming our lives, and how does that fit in with the whole notion of what Advent is about and the major messages of the readings? That reform your life has sort of a realistic character to it. I'm thinking of Advent as a season of hopeful realism, and when it says reform, I mean, I hear a realistic message. That tells me that, hey, all is not well. You don't have it all together yet. Head and heart might not be operating in sync. Not all aspects of your personality are yet in tune with your fundamental orientation or movement towards God. There's need for conversion, for change here in some way. Reform your lives becomes the message. Now, I mean, that's a hard message, because reform is going to require change, and that's scary. And maybe I don't want to get into that. Maybe I don't want to hear this message of the Baptist, just like people at his time didn't want to hear it, this reform thing, because they were probably feeling sort of self-righteous and thinking that they didn't need this reform, that they were on target already. So let's stay with that notion of reform here a minute, and how that plays out for us.
Yes, I can maybe offer some background from a historical point of view, what was going on at the time, and then maybe we could reflect on how that might apply in our present circumstances today.
Good.
But I think that a lot of times people, when they start feeling and experiencing things getting out of whack, it's not going correctly, they review what they've been doing. Where did they start getting off the track, with the idea that maybe they could start over again and this time pick up the pieces correctly and do it the way it ought to be done. If you get lost in when you're driving or something, you figure out, where did I make the wrong turn, and try to pick up the pieces from there. And John the Baptist did the same sort of thing with Israel. He called Israel out to the desert, which in the thought of the time always had that element of being a kind of a honeymoon place, as a place where God was so close to his people during those years in which he was leading them out from the land of Egypt to their promised land.
That takes us back to the Exodus imagery,
correct.
which is always important in the whole of the Scriptures, right?
Exactly. And he calls them out there and has them pass through the Jordan again. The idea of baptism today has only a religious connotation for us, so we miss a lot of this. But the word really means to be plunged into the water and to come up again on the other side. It had all those images with him as well, of course, of being purified as a washing type of process. But because it was precisely in the Jordan, at the point in which Israel entered the Promised Land, just north of the Dead Sea, near Jericho, it had this element of coming back, going through that water again, and now entering into the Promised Land to be the kind of people that they wanted to be, the people they always tried to be but had failed to be before, a people who would be prepared for the coming of the Messiah to be the ideal king and really lead them to be faithful people to God's covenant. And so all those images, the appeal to Isaiah the prophet in the opening part of Matthew's third chapter here, fit into that same context. It's a call to be what we already are, but to be it deliberately and truly, to make up for the mistakes that we've made in the past by realizing the possibilities that lie in the present.
So this reform, therefore, the Baptist really fit that message into his whole perception of the way God had worked with his people. It's almost like redoing something. I mean, the desert experience had to be part of it. And this, as you said, the passing through the Jordan, in a sense, that became one part of the purifying process.
And what I think is real helpful for us 20th century Americans who tend to be fairly individualistic about it is that, again, it reflects both sides of the dynamic. On the one hand, each person needs to reform his or her personal life. No one can do that for someone else. Each of us has to make that decision for ourselves. But the totality, it's an action of the people. The people are preparing themselves to be God's chosen people, to be God's covenant people. And if one person by himself or herself doing this is not going to do the trick. It's the entire people who are called to reform and to live up to their vocation, their election.
It's a very hard thing for us to see very often, I think, precisely because of what you said about the individualism. We often think of us saving our own souls and getting to heaven, and the Scriptures are written in so much more of a communal context. They see solidarity. You're saved as a member of a people and not in isolation. And therefore you get a much more of a community idea. You get this whole idea of Jesus. In fact, what he comes to do is sort of reconstitute the community, bring Israel back and reform, try to get Israel to be faithful as a group. I mean, that's why Jesus said he came to minister to the house of Israel, to reestablish the community that was supposed to be there, bring them back to be faithful to the covenant. And I see the dynamic something, well, if you can get that group doing that, it's not just for their advantage, but then they are to be a light to the nations. Then they are to show how you can live in a proper way. It's like if we can get a parish reforming itself, a group, or even a group within a parish reforming itself, then we begin to see how life could be lived. Now, these people are getting along. They're trying to support one another instead of pulling each other down. They're cooperative instead of being competitive. There you see charity at work. And then I think the idea of the Scriptures and the strategy, in a sense, of the Baptist and of Jesus becomes one of spreading that out, of showing that it can be done, what it actually looks like, as a model for how everyone else ought to live. And that gives you, I think, that communal feeling again.
I'd like to underline that twice. I think that's an extremely important point. Some of our listeners probably experienced the experience that we had in the Diocese of Toledo not just so very long ago when we went through our synod process. And we had people from all over the 19 counties of Northwest Ohio gathered together. And I think that so many of us had that same experience when we saw these several thousand people together doing the same thing, sharing our faith, professing that faith, and finding that faith nourished in the liturgical celebration. The sum was greater than the total was greater than the sum of the parts. An extra dynamic is added when all these people are doing something together. We are strengthened by each other, and with that experience in hand, now we can go out and be the source of, be the kind of example by living out these things that we have experienced ourselves personally. We can be the spark or whatever that helps other people to experience it as well. I
affirm that. I mean, the Synod was a powerful experience that way for the people who were there. I think it was hard to communicate it to the rest of the diocese. I know we tried to do that in our church, but I think it's hard, or if you weren't there, in a sense, to feel that dynamic. And yet, it is a reminder that we are part of this larger community. And I think the Synod did have a power to affect that and to help us. And even the people who experienced it then maybe can give some spark of that to other people, reminding reminder that each individual parish really is a community within a larger community that we call the Church of Toledo, the Diocese of Toledo.
And the second element you brought out, I think, is also deserves comment, or deserves our thinking about, and that is that it's more than just a personal experience within that remains within the individual person. It's something that needs now to be expressed in actions, an outward sort of thing. In this particular reading, the way the New American Bible translates John the Baptist's sentence, he says, give some evidence that you mean to reform. It's not enough just to talk about this and to say the right things. You need to do something to show that your heart's in the right place and that the commitment that you've made is real. And I thought, to bring back the term of realism, that's an eminently realistic approach to faith and to what we're about.
It really is. I'm glad you brought that line out. He starts it out this way. When he saw that many of the Pharisees, and that's John the Baptist now, and were stepping forward for this bath, this baptism, he said to them, you brood of vipers. So he's sort of hard on them, and I think maybe, and the usual thing in the Scriptures is that the Pharisaical attitude is what one doesn't like. It's the attitude of self-righteousness, that I don't need any sort of help here. So he says to these brood of vipers, these self-righteous people, who told you to flee from the wrath to come? Then give some evidence that you mean to reform. And I think that really is part of the realism of this Advent season. I mean, I think we can say that, addressed to ourselves. I mean, while we are a member of a community, we still are called by name by God, and within that community context, we have to have a conversion of our own heart. We have to find a way to reform. And it's almost like the gospel is shouting through it, reform your life and give evidence of it. So get with it now. Don't fool around. There's an immediacy to the call. And change in a way that's palpable, that gives evidence. So, what would it be saying? Make a difference. At the work site, instead of being a grouch and making life miserable for people, why not be part of the solution so that we create a more harmonious situation there at work? Let's take the vice that we've been struggling with for so long, and let's continue to try to work on it. We need to work on it. Reform your life means we can't just drift along. Give some evidence of all of this means that it's got to be put into practice on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think coming from a historical point of view, there's so much there that is really rich. One of the things that Matthew does in telling this particular story, as you heard, is that he takes John the Baptist's statement, his very harsh statement there, and implies that it was directed just to the authorities of the time, rather than to the crowd as a whole. And the reason for that, of course, is that Matthew, as we read through his gospel, wants us to hear in the background a criticism of the authorities of his day, Matthew's own day, who were preventing people from living out, from following Jesus, as Matthew was convinced that they ought to do. So he uses what John the Baptist says here to make that point. But I think that it's for us to put ourselves into this picture and to really hear what happens here. We Christians have got a very warped idea of the Pharisees, for example, in our
very
understanding.
Very important to get that straight. Yeah.
I have struggled in my own preaching to give an analogy of what this would have sounded like originally, and I guess what I'm working with right now is that it would be a little bit as if John the Baptist saw Mother Teresa's sisters coming up and saying, "You brood of vipers," and so forth. It would be utterly shocking to people. They would be scandalized, and the people that everyone assumed were doing the best job of following Jesus are now being criticized and saying that they too need to reform their lives. Well, what John the Baptist is doing here is exactly that effect. He's taking the people that stood head and shoulders above in their culture, were just assumed to be the people who were obeying God's law, God's will, closer than anyone else, and saying they too needed to reform their lives. I'm sure that message had a powerful impact on the people.
Yes, striking statement. And it's very important for us to, I think, realize that the goodness of the Pharisees and their sincerity about the law, because they're often painted as the bad people, and I think that comes a lot from Matthew, written in the middle 80s or around there, feeling a need to get that slant into his writing. But often, maybe another way, I like the way you said that, and it is a striking image that you use, probably too strong for some people, but it is striking there, the way you said that, of saying, taking Mother Teresa's sisters and saying that to them. We better not do that, Ken. But anyway, it does make the point. I suppose another way of doing that, which I've often tried to do, is to talk about the Pharisaical attitude, and which we have come to associate with a self-righteousness, in the sense that I don't need to reform because I have it made, and I'm one of those good people, and I walk in the light. And that is what is being challenged here, it seems to me. It's another way of coming at the same point, I think.
I would say that if we would have John the Baptist here preaching to us today, I think a lot of times he would, the words or the analogy would be something like, don't tell me you're Catholics. God can make Catholics out of these stones. Don't tell me you're a born-again Christian. God can make born-again Christians out of these stones. Yeah. Any little label that we want to choose to say, okay, we got it made, and now we can afford to look down on other people as being as being unworthy, as being sinners, while we have got it made, that just shows that we're falling exactly into the trap that John the Baptist skewers here so finely.
Yes,
strongly.
Reform your lives, he says. Now, that sets up another kind of problem in my mind, Ken, and that is that, it would be easy with this great call to reform for someone to take it serious and say, well, that's right, I got to reform, I got to get it straight, I got to get myself going, I got to straighten up, I've been wasting all this time and so on, got to give the evidence right now. And I think there's a counterpoint that I see in this second reading. These beautiful Advent readings here. The second Sunday is from Romans 15. Romans seems to be popular here in this Advent time. Romans 15. And now we've got a sort of a notion of patience that I want to pick up on. It says, everything written before our time was written for our instruction, that we might derive hope from the lessons of patience. And that comes up, may God, the source of all patience and encouragement, enable you to live in perfect harmony with one another. And so I'm seeing now a counterpoint to this, so that we remember that the process of reform is really in God's hands. And because of that, we ought to be patient with ourselves. There's a sense in which we can't rush the process. There's another side to this thing, and I think that says, look, don't get down on yourself. You don't have to give evidence every minute, in a sense, or remember it's a process. It's going to take time to accomplish, and remember God is with you in all of this. So I'd like to look at this Romans reading here, the 15th chapter, verses 4 to 9, and that patience side of it as part of what we ought to see in this second Sunday of Advent.
Yes, I also fasten to the same phrases that you did, that you just mentioned there, that God is the source of patience and the source of encouragement. And what's been written here is not supposed to be discouraging us. It's supposed to be encouraging us.
Even the harsh statements of John the Baptist.
Statements, exactly. I think that in any family you have a situation where parents they sometimes scold their children. They exercise discipline with their children, not because they don't love their children, not because they want bad things to happen to them, but exactly the opposite. It's because they want the very best good things to happen to them, that they keep on them to live up to their potential, to have the kind of behavior whereby they're not hurt and they are helped in their life. And I think it's exactly the same thing with God. The reason why the Scriptures speak very strongly, very forcefully to us sometimes and tell us to shape up is not because God wants to make life more difficult or more difficult for us, but rather because God does not want us to lose even one iota of the good that God has in store for us.
And I think that that is a very pastorally important thing, and it's important for people who are serious about the spiritual life and who take Advent seriously, to hear that message. In other words, it's possible to get sort of uptight about the spiritual growth. It's possible to get too hard on ourselves, to get down on ourselves when we don't live up to our ideals. And so there's a patience with self that's needed. And I ask myself, where does that come from, though? And I think it comes from the idea that God is patient with us in one way, that God never abandons us.
Yes.
So how am I going to be patient with myself and not just, really beat myself because I'm not living up to every ideal, because God is with me and God understands all of that. God is really the source of the growth that would be achieved here.
What's very interesting is that comes up in this very passage by way of what's assumed and what's taken for granted. In the context here in chapter 14, what Paul has been telling the Romans is that they need to be sensitive to each other. Those who are strong should be willing to give up some of their rights in favor of the weak for their conscience sake. He says, because that's what Christ did. he willingly, he quotes Psalm 68, that the insults of those who insulted you fell upon me. Christ willingly accepted those things that we might have riches. And so in about the middle of this little passage, maybe verses 6 or 7 or so, Paul tells the Romans, now welcome each other the way Christ has welcomed you. What he takes for granted there is that welcome, that acceptance that Christ has for us. He didn't wait until we had it all right, got our act together, and were good folks before he was willing to condescend to be seen in our company. He welcomed us as we were, and it's that welcome that now gives us the encouragement to take the next step forward and to become all that he sees that we can be.
Ken, can we look at that first reading on this second Sunday of Advent? It's from Isaiah 11. Isaiah is a favorite Advent figure, isn't he? I mean,
yes, he is.
His rich and vivid kind of writing seems perfect for the season. Not only that, but he has a great sense of future, and part of his whole message was to bring hope to his people. And therefore, very often, I think these passages are helpful to us. And as we look about this business of how we're going to reform our lives, that's the point, isn't it? Here we're saying, reform your lives, that's the message of the gospel, but be patient with yourself because God is with you in all of this, because you're in God's hands. Now, part of the way God is with us here is this beautiful passage from Isaiah is about the Spirit of the Lord. It shall rest upon this important figure he's talking about, and I think we can say this is the Spirit that rests upon all of us. It's the same Spirit. It's a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and of strength, a spirit of knowledge and of fear of the Lord. So we can see sort of the whole of life caught up here in this notion of the Spirit. This wisdom and understanding is something that sort of helps us with our knowledge, so we know what's going on. And then there's sort of these practical abilities that we need to attend to here, to have a spirit of counsel, be prudent, know what to do, and be courageous in going about it. And then there's sort of a piety or a reverential attitude towards God that is needed if we're going to function in this way. So I guess what I'm getting out of this is that as we go about this notion of reform your life, we are actually tapping a spirit that is within us. It's not like there's an external prod out there or a magnet that's drawing us forward. That's there, and there is a message that comes to us, a word in the Scriptures. But there's this interior spirit that's been given to us that we need to tap, and it's a spirit that's powerful and filled with great potential.
Yes, I think that comes out even more powerfully when you realize the context here is that Isaiah has just been talking about Assyria, the pagan nation, as a very vast and mighty tree, and talking about that God is going to take that proud, boastful, cruel tree and lop it off, cut it down, burn it up, root and branch, and now it's going to make out of poor Jacob, or poor Jesse, that stump, a new shoot sprout forth, endowed with the Spirit which will allow all this potential to come into being.
That is a great dream, isn't it? So as we go about the reform, Ken, that we see this call on the second Sunday of Advent, we do so with great confidence because we got the Spirit within us and because there's this great dream we have that God is going to accomplish it all and fulfill it. And so Advent, again, is this season to be on alert, but it's finally a season of hope, of absolute confidence that God will accomplish what He has promised.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talked with Father Ken Mormon, who is a scriptural scholar and priest of the Diocese of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was Reforming Our Lives. If you have any comments on this week's program or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo. Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
It sets up for me this whole sort of quest for peace and the importance of being a peacemaker. And I'm talking about not just on the global scene, but in